Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus Red coming at you with a slightly different video. Kind of on the back of the sideboard guide we did last week. I wanted to do a little bit of a numbers driven thing about where Burn has been in the meta over the last 6 to 8 months. Now, for those of you who like the gameplay videos or a little bit more flashy graphics, this one's going to be a little bit more data driven, so if you don't like that, I do apologize. Next week we will be back to our normal Burn gameplay. So I've been talking about for a while that Burn has not been the best positioned deck in the meta, especially against, say, the top decks. Now, it still has reasonable matchups against a lot of the field, but I want to do a little bit of a numbers analysis to show, exactly where Burn is against decks like Scam and Murktide and the top 10 decks really of the last 6 to 8 months. Now, this data only goes through August, middle of August, I believe. It was compiled by NOL Yahi or Yahi Anuel. Never quite get those names right, so I do apologize, but I'll try to link to the two data sources that he provided. One is basically paper meta, one is, I believe, paper and online meta. And then we'll take a look at from June until current, where I've been tracking my own Burn gameplay and seeing, how we're doing against various different decks. Now, for starters, Rakdos Scam is obviously the best deck in the format. If you look at from the middle of February until the middle of June, not so good. If you look from middle of June till the end of August, Burn actually had a fairly decent win rate against Rakdos Scam. Overall, Burn has slightly disfavorable thing, but the matchup's probably pretty close to 50-50. Now, what would I attribute to that to? I would say as the popularity of Scam increased, the skill of the player in general of the deck decreased. So Burn tends to do better against less experienced Scam pilots, tends to do a little bit worse against experienced Scam pilots, and that feels about average for where I feel the matchup is. Probably with Burn being, it's probably a little bit play draw dependent, and the matchup is pretty close to 50-50. Now, Murktide I've always talked about being probably not the best matchup for Burn. There was a period of time where when Murktide was first developing, I felt Burn had a very good matchup. But as things have gone along and Murktide's pilots have continued to evolve and increase their skill, and they've continued to add more to the deck, while Burn has remained fairly static with the cards that it's able to play, not necessarily where they are in the 75. For instance, Eidolon out, and Roiling Vortex in, those kind of things. The matchup has remained pretty consistently bad. In February through June, Burn was at about a 40% clip. In June through August, Burn was about a 30% clip. Once again, kind of the inverse of the Rakdos Scam thing. As the more dedicated people continued to play the deck and less people played the deck overall, the skill level of the Murktide pilot probably increased, and Burn's playability in that matchup kind of decreased. Omnath pile, one of the few matchups where Burn is actually favored, and that's kind of what I've seen over time, although it's not overly something like Green Tron that we'll talk about in a bit. If you look at from February through June, about 50-50. From June through August, with the inclusion of the One Ring and such, Burn has slightly higher clip. Now, I did not include Omnath Elementals, they were split on Anuel's thing for February through June, as I feel like Omnath Pile is pretty much the Omnath control deck at this point. The Elementals deck's kind of having fallen off the wayside. Overall, Burn probably wins about a 55% win clip, which feels about right. You feel slightly favored, but they definitely have the tools to take you to the woodshed sometimes. Hammer Time, another matchup that I would say is abysmal for Burn. Kind of very similar to Murktide from February till June, when the deck was a little bit more played. Burn was about a 25% clip, and then ever since Hammer Time's kind of dropped off, and really only the dedicated pilots continue to play it, Burn's win percentage got a little bit worse, leading to about a 22% win percentage for Burn over 164 matches. So a fairly decent sample size, not good for Team Burn. Living End, now a lot of people say that at least some burn pilots I've seen said living in is good for burn. It's not anymore. Between grief, force of negation, and leyline of sanctity out of the board, the matchup is play draw dependent. If you look at the bigger amount of data from February till June, there was actually less matches played with living in than in the 2 month span from June till August. Burn kind of got trounced, about a 40% win clip, and then from June till August, when there was a little bit more people playing the deck, so average skill pile of the deck going down a little bit, matchup was a little bit closer, about 50-50. Overall, living in is slightly favored, and that feels about right with what's been going on, despite the changes to the Burn deck of recent note. Rhinos, now this is once again another matchup that Burn has felt like a slight dog. Rhinos is probably next to Burn one of the easier decks to pick up in the format. So if you're ever looking to get into the modern format and not playing a deck like Burn as an intro deck, if you have the additional money to spend, I would honestly probably recommend Rhinos, as it feels a bit better positioned, and really there's not a ton to learn to initially learn to play the deck, much like Burn. Rhinos, 44% from February till June, 40% from June till August, and then so about a 43% win clip, even with the inclusion of Roiling Vortex in the main. Feels about average. Yawgmoth, this is another one of those matchups that feels kind of close, with the earlier part of the year, Burn being a little bit of a dog, later part of the year, Burn a slight favorite, and then overall Burn a slight dog in about 70% of the matchups. I think the matchup's even gotten a little bit worse with the addition of Cauldron, and as they add things like Shouldered to their lists. But a very good Yawgmoth pilot, once again, kind of usually beats up on Burn. Amulet Titan, I would have thought that this was Burn's worst matchup, but just looking from the statistics, it honestly looks like Hammer is actually a worse matchup. So about the same percentage both portions of the year so far, about a 30% win percentage over 109 matches. Feels about right. You do have a shot in the matchup, but it's not very good. Green Tron. This is the deck Burn wants to play against. You have an over 75% win clip against both portions, and then a 77% win percentage overall, over 94 matches. Pretty convincing. That's one of Burn's better matchups. And then creativity, much like Omnath Pile, you feel like a slight favorite against, and the numbers kind of bear that out. Now, a couple takeaways I take away from this data. Number one, Burn is not the best deck in the format to be playing. There's a reason why it's slipped out of most people's top 10 lists as far as decks to play in the format. That's not to say you can't win games. That's not to say in local metas you can't do extremely well with Burn. That's just simply to say that in bigger events in general, Burn has not been performing particularly well. Takeaways from that: number one, the more skilled the base pilot of a deck, the more difficult of matchup a lot of these matchups for Burn. A lot of matchups anymore in Modern, they don't generally have hate cards for Burn, but a lot of these decks have a very similar time frame for Burn. But a lot of them present disruption or life gain, or fast clock, just something that Burn didn't used to have to face. Say when you were playing against Blue-White X Control, when you were playing against just random things that used to exist in the format that really don't anymore. Most decks in the format are very proactive. Most things are doing something very powerful by turn 3 or turn 4, and really just kind of restricts Burn's mobility without having any significant additions to the deck since really MH1. The skill pilot of the Burn deck certainly matters. You can certainly gain some skill points. That last 10 or 20% of learning the Burn deck really can make or break you in these really tight matchups. But the skill pilot of your opponent is incredibly important, especially decks like Scam and Murktide and Yawgmoth. Those decks especially really, the better the gameplay or the skill of the opponent, the more difficult the match is. Much like the old Grixis Shadow matchups used to be very much about the skill of the Grixis Shadow pilot, even more than it was of the Burn pilot. That's not to say, as we kind of went over in our sideboard guide for a lot of these decks, you don't have tools, you can't win certain games, but that's just kind of an overall where Burn is in the format. Look at my numbers overall for 69 matches. It should have been 70, but I didn't feel like playing the last of that 04 mono red league that we did a couple weeks ago. If you look at Rakdos Scam, we've played 8 matches against them overall. 10 game wins, 12 game losses. The matchup itself is 50-50. Feels about right. Hammer Time, we've played 2 matches, gotten stomped both times. Once again, feels about right. Omnath Elementals, which is an offshoot of thing we've played 4 matches against and only gone 1-3. Yeah, we've had some tough games in some of those matches, but that still feels like a matchup that's slightly favorable overall. Living End, we've won 4 out of 6 matches, but once again, I feel like that matchup's very tight every time we play it. Team of Rhinos, we've played against it 3 times and won 3 matches. Feels like we've gotten a little bit fortunate there. Murktide, we've only played 1 match, which is kind of crazy, but it has been a deck that has fallen off, and we did win that 1 match. And then Creativity, 100% in 2 matches. Why is there 2 Is It Murktides? Okay, Blue-Red Murktide, 100% here. Is It Murktide, 50-50. So 2 and 1 against Murktide overall. Got to clean that up in the data here. But Herd and Scales, a deck that's kind of been on the rise. We've only played 1 match and lost that one. So all that to say basically that a lot of the data kind of backs up what my own feelings with where Burn is in the meta. Now, is Burn a deck worth investing in? Sure. If it's, especially as a kind of budget entry into the format, it's a little bit cheaper than a deck like Rhinos, which I would probably say is probably the best beginner-friendly deck in the format now in terms of a deck that will have longevity. That's not to say, MH3 coming out soon, Burn can't get something akin to a Price of Progress or Fire Blast or something and push the deck right back up to Tier 1 or Tier 1.5. But as things currently stand, as you look at a lot of these top decks, there's only really 3 matchups that are somewhat favorable for Burn, and 2 of those decks, Tron and Creativity, just really aren't a huge part of the top 10. And a lot of the matchups that we get paired against are either close coin flips, or it's decks like Hammer or Amulet were just very bad dogs too. But yeah, I just figured I wanted to do a data-driven approach as opposed to, a feeling of how the matchup goes. I'd look at a little empirical data this time around to give you somewhat of a feel for where Burn is in the meta. If you like these kind of videos, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you're a Burn fan, as I'll be definitely going back to gameplay next week, but wanted to get a little bit of more data-driven stuff out there. As I'm kind of talking about, when I'm playing this matchup feels terrible, or it's great, it's this and that. These are kind of the numbers that back it up a little bit. Once again, if you have Twitter, go ahead and give Anhuel Yahai a follow. He does a lot of data-driven things for a lot of different formats. He and Frank Karsten do a lot of work with different things. His decks, he's just the best at separating the decks out by matrices, whereas Frank does a little bit better job of, say, tracking what percentage of the format is actually played of a current deck. So, give them both follow if you're a little bit more of a data nerd for Magic. But that said, if you like these kind of Burn videos, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for next week's video.